There's a certain kind of man who mistakes simplicity for failure. He sees a modest truck and assumes the driver couldn't afford better. He sees a quiet man at the end of the table and decides, without much investigation, that the quiet is the whole story. He sees a flannel shirt and no watch and shoes that have been resold once, and he does the math in his head, and he arrives at a number, and he is satisfied with that number, and he never checks his work. I have encountered this kind of man many times over the course of my life, in boardrooms and on job sites, and at family dinners with the good plates out and the wine already open. Usually I find them interesting in the way you find a particular kind of engineering problem interesting, not because it is difficult, but because the solution is already visible if you know where to look, and the only real question is how long you want to wait before you apply it. This time, the man was sitting at a dinner table I had quietly helped pay for, in a house I had co-signed for 3 years prior, without being asked for recognition or repayment. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has outstayed its usefulness, and he was saying things out loud that most people in his position would have at least had the basic instinct to keep inside their own head. And I let him. I let him finish every word. I let him feel the full weight of what he believed about me. Because I want you to understand something before we get into what happened over the next 31 days. I want you to understand it early, because it is a thing that explains every decision I made and every decision I did not make. The most powerful position a man can occupy is the one where the other person has badly, completely, confidently miscalculated the distance between you. That position is not created by argument. It is not created by correction. It is created by patience, by years of it, by the specific, deliberate practice of letting people believe what they want to believe until the moment arrives when the belief meets a reality, and you are nowhere near the room when it happens. My name is Gerald Pruitt. I am 67 years old. I have lived in Hartford, Connecticut for 22 years, and before that I spent 11 years in Columbus, Ohio, doing work I will describe in a moment. I drive a 2009 Ford Ranger with 174,000 miles on the odometer. There is a crack in the passenger seat vinyl that I have been meaning to repair since approximately the spring of 2019. I have not repaired it. I make my coffee in a $12 drip machine, and I take it black, and without exception, I allow it to go cold because I get distracted thinking, which my late mother considered character flaw, and which I have come to regard as simply the way my mind operates. My daughter Renata will tell you her father is a simple man. She is not wrong about the man she grew up watching. She is, as it turns out, somewhat incomplete in her understanding of what that man was doing all those years while she was watching him be simple. But we will get to that. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get comfortable, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. I want to tell you about the life that built a man like me, because none of what happened at that dinner table makes sense without the 40 years that came before it. I graduated from the University of Connecticut in May of 1980 with a civil engineering degree that I had financed entirely by myself. Summers on road crews in Waterbury, winters in a machine shop in Bridgeport that smelled like cutting fluid and cold concrete, and the specific fatigue of men who've been doing physical work since before I was born. I was not a remarkable student in the sense that the word is usually meant. I was not the one the professors remembered by name or pointed to when they wanted to illustrate a concept. I was thorough. I showed my work. I checked it twice. I have found, over the course of a long career, that thoroughness outlasts brilliance at a rate that would surprise most people who are counting on brilliance. I worked 8 years at a municipal engineering firm in New Haven, roads, drainage systems, a bridge rehabilitation project in 1984 that took 16 months and is, as far as I know, still carrying traffic today. I was not the lead on that bridge. I was the one who caught the error in the load calculation on page 47 of the preliminary report at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, over a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I was reading. That error, if it had gone through, would have cost the city approximately $340,000 in remediation and possibly someone's professional license. I flagged it in a memo. I did not make a scene about it. The project lead thanked me briefly in the hallway. That was sufficient. The bridge is still standing. That is the outcome I cared about. From the firm, I moved to a private contractor. 3 more years. Then, in 1993, I made a decision that felt at the time like a reasonable risk and turned out to be the most consequential thing I ever did with money. I had been saving since 1981, not aggressively, not with a spreadsheet and a target date, though I admire people who operate that way, just carefully. Every raise, I kept my expenses flat and moved the difference somewhere would work harder than I would. By 1993, I had $44,000, every dollar of it documented, and I put it into a commercial property on Morse Road in Columbus, a squat, unremarkable 2-story building with 6 office suites, a flat roof that had been repaired 3 times in the previous decade with decreasing quality each time, and a parking lot that looked like it had been paved during the Eisenhower administration and not meaningfully touched since. The roof cost me $18,400. The parking lot cost me $7,200. I did not do either job myself, but I managed both contractors with the same approach I brought to every engineering project I had ever worked on. Scope, schedule, sequence, written documentation of every conversation that involved a number or a commitment. I found tenants for all 6 suites within 4 months. I managed the leases myself because I could not yet afford to have someone else do it, and because I believe correctly that the only way to learn a business is to do the parts of it that are difficult until they become manageable. I made mistakes in those first 2 years. I want to be specific about that, because I think people who tell stories about building things sometimes omit the part where they were wrong about several things for a considerable period of time. I had a tenant in Suite 3 who paid late 11 months in a row, and I was too accommodating about it for too long, because I was still learning where the line was between reasonable patience and self-defeating tolerance. I had a vendor relationship that cost me more than it should have for 18 months before I found an alternative. I misjudged market rate on 2 of the suites in the first renewal cycle and left money on the table that I did not need to leave. None of these mistakes were catastrophic. All of them were educational. I did not repeat any of them. By 2001, I had 3 properties in Columbus. By 2007-9, in 2002, I moved back to Hartford because Renata was here and my mother was in her late 70s and beginning to need more help than distance would allow. And because Connecticut had always felt like where I was from in a way that Ohio, for all its plainness that I genuinely respect, never quite did. I set up a property management company in Hartford. I called it Cornerstone Property Group, which is a name I chose because it is neutral and professional and tells you nothing about the man behind it. The name was intentional. I had learned by then that a quiet operation attracts a different quality of problem than a loud one. Less competition for the same deals. Fewer people try and get in front of you to sell you things you don't need. When you're the kind of owner nobody has heard of, the tenants who find you are usually the kind who came looking for space, not connections. I hired Dolores Crane as my property manager in 2004. Dolores is 58 years old, has been managing commercial properties since before I owned my first one, and operates with the specific efficiency of a person who understands that her job is to make the properties run and make the owner's phone not ring. And she executes both objectives with precision that I have tried over 20 years to adequately express my gratitude for and mostly failed. She knows what I own. Her assistant knows what she tells him. Almost nobody else does. By the time my daughter Renata married Marcus Holt in the fall of 2017, I owned 23 commercial properties across Connecticut, Ohio, and North Carolina, 11 of them in Hartford. I drove the Ranger. I wore the same shirts. I showed up to family dinners with a bag of groceries and fixed the things around their house that needed fixing and asked about the grandchildren and went home a reasonable hour. I was Gerald Pruitt, Renata's father, the quiet one, the retired engineer with the old truck. That was the man Marcus Holt met. That was the man he decided, with the swift confidence of someone who charges by the impression he makes, that he understood completely. I want to be fair to Marcus, because fairness is something I believe in even when the other person has not extended it to me. Marcus Holt is not a bad man. He is a man who learned young that confidence presented early enough reads as competence, and that most people will not stop to verify the difference. He was charming in the visible ways. He remembered birthdays. He held doors. He shook hands with both hands and made eye contact that lasted exactly long enough to signal that he was taking you seriously without crossing into something uncomfortable. He was good to Renata in the ways that a person is good to someone when they know they are being watched. What he was toward me was something more precisely described as dismissive. It was not loud. It was a small, steady kind, the kind that operates through what it leaves out rather than what it puts in. He would ask me a question and then answer it himself before I had finished responding. He would describe my engineering background in conversation with his friends the way you describe a relative's hobby that you find charming but not serious. At Renata's birthday dinner in April of 2019, he introduced me to a colleague as Renata's dad, old school engineer, retired, and then turned away before I could add anything, which I had not planned to do but which still registered as a kind of casual erasure that I stored, as I store most things, without comment. I want to be specific about the evening that changed the shape of things, because specificity is how I keep memory honest. It was Saturday, March 11th. I arrived at their house on Wethersfield Avenue at 6:14 in the evening. Renata had made pot roast, which she does on the third Saturday of most months in the winter, and which is, without exaggeration, one of the better things I eat on a regular basis. My granddaughters, Lily, who is 9, and Clara, who just turned 6 in February, had set the table themselves. The forks were on the wrong side. Clara had placed a crayon drawing of what I believe was intended to be a horse at my seat. It may have been a dog. I chose to believe it was a horse, because Lily had gone through a horse phase the previous summer, and I thought it was a tribute. And tribute deserves the benefit of the doubt. We ate. Marcus opened a bottle of wine. He described at some length. The conversation moved the way conversations move at family dinners. From the surface of one thing to the surface of another, nobody going very deep because the children were at the table and because depth at dinner requires a kind of agreement that wasn't quite present that evening. At some point, Marcus began talking about a deal he was working on, a commercial lease negotiation at a property in the Colt Gateway complex. He described the square footage, the tenant profile, the commission structure, with the particular fluency of a man who has discovered that if he controls the subject of conversation, he can also control the room's impression of him. He was good at it. I will give him that. Then he set his wine glass down. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has decided to be generous. He said, "Gerald, can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Go ahead." He said, "What was your best year when you were engineering? What did you clear?" The table shifted slightly. Renata's hand moved toward her water glass and stopped. Lily looked up from whatever she was drawing on her napkin. Clara was working through a dinner roll with the focused dedication of a person for whom bread is a serious undertaking. I said, "Enough for what I needed." He smiled. It was a particular smile of a man who has received the answer he was expecting and is now going to use it. He said, "I ask because, and I mean this with total respect, Gerald, genuinely, I think a lot of men from your generation worked incredibly hard their whole lives and just never really thought in terms of building anything beyond the next paycheck. Different era, different mindset. Nobody taught you to think about assets the way we think about assets now." He picked up his wine glass again. "But I look at where you are at 67 and I think, and again, I say this with respect, you've never really built anything in the investment sense. You rent, which is completely fine. There's no shame in it. I just think about what it would feel like to get to that point in life and realize you played it safe when you didn't have to." The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator was running. Clara had stopped eating her roll. Lily was looking at her drawing. I let it sit for 3 full seconds. Then I said, "You're probably right, Marcus." And I meant none of it, not one syllable. But there are lessons that cannot be delivered with words. They require demonstration. And the most important variable in a demonstration is not the content. It is the timing. I said goodnight to Lily and Clara at 8:31. I hugged Renata at the door. I drove home in the Ranger with the windows down despite the cold, because I find cold air useful when I am thinking. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and drop your thoughts in the comments. I got home at 8:53. I made a pot of coffee that I did not particularly need and would not adequately drink. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one with the water stain on the left corner that I've been intending to sand and refinish for several years and have not gotten to, partly because of time and partly because the stain has become a kind of landmark that I have grown accustomed to finding when I sit down to think. And I sat there for a while. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think honesty is what makes a story like this worth telling. I did not feel rage. I am not a man built for rage, and I do not think rage is useful in most of the situations where people reach for it. What I felt was something quieter and more specific than that. I felt the weight of 40 years of work being described by a man who had known me for 5 years and understood almost none of it as the absence of ambition. I felt the specific, cold clarity of a man who has been underestimated not carelessly, but deliberately, with a smile, in front of his grandchildren. I let myself feel that for as long as it deserved. Then I got up and opened the second drawer of the kitchen desk. The folder is not a dramatic object. It is a standard manila folder with a rubber band around it and a small label that reads Prop Summary, current in my handwriting. Inside are the quarterly ownership summaries that Dolores sends me, printed and organized by city. I update them when they arrive. I keep paper because paper does not require a password and does not crash. I found the Hartford summary, and I sat back down at the table, and I opened it. I was looking for Marcus's office. I was looking because it had occurred to me on the drive home that Hartford is not a large city, and that a man who works in commercial real estate and leases office space in Hartford exists in a relatively small universe of available properties, several of which I own. It was not a certainty. It was a reasonable hypothesis. And engineers verify their hypotheses before they act on them. I found it on page 3, Holt Commercial Properties, Suite 204 and Suite 206 at 1140 Flatbush Avenue. 1,840 square feet combined. Monthly rent of $4,380. Lease expiration, April 14th. Renewal notice due from tenant by March 31st. I sat with that for a long moment. I am not going to tell you I was surprised. Exactly. I was something more like confirmed. The city was not that large. The overlap was, statistically, not unreasonable. I had acquired that building in 2021, and Marcus's lease had been in place since 2019, carried over from the previous ownership. He had never, in 5 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, mentioned the name of his building or his landlord. I had never thought to ask. I called Dolores at 9:22 p.m. I apologized for the hour. She answered on the second ring, which she always does, which is one of many reasons I have never seriously considered replacing her. I said, Dolores, I need to look at the whole commercial file. Suites 204 and 206 on Flatbush. She said, they sent a preliminary renewal intent in January. 2-year term, same rate. I was going to bring it to you next week for sign-off. I said, what is the current market rate for that square footage? She was quiet for a moment. When Dolores is quiet, it is not because she does not know the answer. It is because she is deciding how to frame it. She said, Gerald, you're sitting at least $800 a month below market, probably closer to $960. I have been meaning to raise this with you on the next review cycle. I said, don't process the renewal. Another pause, shorter this time. She said, understood. Do you want me to issue a non-renewal notice or hold off? I said, issue it. Standard certified mail. Professional and clean. She said, timeline? I said, March 18th, give them the proper notice period. She said, I'll handle it Monday morning. I said, thank you, Dolores. I'm sorry for the hour. She said, Gerald, go to sleep. I did not go to sleep immediately, but I did eventually. I called Raymond Chu on the morning of March 19th. Raymond has been my commercial real estate attorney for 16 years. He practices out a second-floor office on Pearl Street that has not changed in any meaningful way since I first walked into it in 2008, which I find reassuring in a way that any consistent and reliable thing is reassuring. Raymond is 61 years old, approximately 5'7", and speaks with the deliberate economy of a man who learned early in his career that unnecessary words in a legal context have a way of becoming liabilities. He has handled acquisition agreements, lease disputes, two situations involving tenants who had developed creative interpretations of lease language that did not survive contact with Raymond's specific form of patient correction, and one situation in 2016 that I will not describe here, but which resolved entirely in my favor within 40 days. He is, without qualification, the best attorney I have worked with. I explained the situation to Raymond in broad terms, not the dinner, not Marcus's remarks. Those were personal and not relevant to the legal matter. What was relevant was that I had a commercial tenant whose lease was expiring, that I had issued a non-renewal at current terms, and that I was prepared to offer a new lease at market rate and wanted the documentation prepared properly. Raymond said, "What's the relationship with the tenant?" I said, "He is my son-in-law." Raymond was quiet for 4 seconds. He said, "Gerald." I said, "The business matter is separate from the family matter, Raymond. I'd like to keep it that way in how we handle it." He said, "All right, market rate for 1,840 square feet on Flatbush." I said, "Dolores puts it $5,340. 2-year term. Standard first, last, and deposit." He said, "I'll have the offer drawn up by Tuesday." I said, "I'd also like to be prepared for possibility that he comes looking for the ownership." Raymond said, "He will. That building's ownership traces through Cornerstone to Pruitt Holdings. A competent broker will find in a few days once he starts pulling the LLC." I said, "What he does, I want him to have the opportunity to make a good decision on his own. I don't want anyone calling him or reaching out. I want him to arrive at the information himself." Raymond looked at me the way Raymond sometimes looks at me when he thinks I am being more patient than the situation strictly requires. He said, "And if he doesn't make a good decision?" I said, "Then he signs a new lease at market rate and finds better manners on his own schedule. Either way, I've lost nothing." Raymond said, "I'll have the documents ready Wednesday." I said, "Thank you, Raymond." I walked back to the Ranger at 10:44 a.m. The March air was cold and clean and specific in a way that early spring air in Hartford is specific. Like the city is deciding whether to be done with winter or not and hasn't quite committed. I drove to a diner on Asylum Avenue where I had been eating breakfast irregularly since 2007, and I ordered eggs and toast, and I drank the coffee they brought me while it was still hot, which felt like a small but meaningful victory. The non-renewal notice went out March 18th. Certified mail, on Cornerstone letterhead. Professional, 2 pages. Signed by Dolores Crane, property manager, on behalf of ownership. The new lease offer followed on March 22nd. $5,340 per month, 2-year term, all standard terms. No letter from me, no explanation, just the documents, because the documents were self-explanatory. Dolores called me on March 23rd at 3:17 p.m. She said Marcus had called the Cornerstone office twice that morning trying to determine who owned the building. She had given him the standard response, that his inquiry would be passed along to the relevant party. She said his tone was controlled, but that she could hear the specific quality of a man who was doing math in his head while trying not to show it. Renata called me that same evening at 7-Eleven. I was eating leftover soup, which is, I want to note, significantly better the second day than the first, a fact I consider underappreciated, and I let it go to voicemail. I called her back at 7:34. She told me Marcus had received the non-renewal notice and the new lease offer, and that he was trying to find out who owned the building, because the name Cornerstone didn't mean anything to him. She said he'd been on the phone most of the day. She said carefully, "Dad, do you know anything about this?" I said, "Renata, how is Clara feeling? She seemed a little quiet at dinner last week." There was a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. She said, "She's fine, Dad." I said, "Good. I'm glad. Get some sleep, sweetheart." She said, "Dad." I said, "I'll see you Sunday." He figured it out on March 29th. His broker ran the LLC. Cornerstone traces to Pruitt Holdings. Pruitt Holdings has one principal. Dolores called me at 11:47 a.m. and said very calmly, "Gerald." He knows. He just called. He was composed. He asked if Gerald Pruitt was the principal owner. I told him I'd pass the message along. I said, "Tell him Tuesday. My house. 2 o'clock. She said, done. I said, thank you, Dolores. She said, Gerald, are you all right? I thought about that for a moment. I said, I'm fine. I'll talk to you Wednesday. He arrived at 1:57 p.m. on April 1st. I watched his silver 2023 BMW pull up from the kitchen window. I gave him 45 seconds before I opened the front door, which I spent standing at the counter with my coffee cup. He was wearing a suit. He had his portfolio. He had the posture of a man who had prepared something in the car and was now committed to delivering it. I opened the door and said, Marcus, come in. I walked him to the kitchen. I poured him coffee. He sat down across from me at the table with the stain on the left corner, and he set the portfolio down and did not open it. He said, Gerald, I owe you an apology. I said, all right. He said, what I said at dinner was wrong. It was disrespectful. You have my word that I understand that. He looked at the table for a moment. I had no idea about any of it. Renata never, I knew you owned maybe a rental property. I thought maybe two. I didn't know. A pause. 23 properties? I said, give or take. He was quiet. Then quietly, I've driven past that building on Flatbush for 3 years. I said, I know. Something in me had gone very still by that point. Not triumphant. Not warm. Just still. The specific stillness of a man who has waited for the correct moment and arrived at it, and is now prepared to conduct the business in front of him. I said, Marcus, I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the way it's meant. Not as a punishment. Not as a lecture. I don't deliver lectures to people in my kitchen. He nodded. I said, the lease offered Dolores sent you as fair. It is market rate for that location. And that's square footage. You can sign it and stay in those suites for as long as you operate a good business there. And whatever happened at dinner in March has no bearing on that. I want to be clear about that. Those are two separate things, and I intend to keep them separate. He said, I understand. I said, what I'd like from you, not as a landlord, but as the father of your wife, is for you to think about what you concluded about a man you had known for 5 years, based on his truck, based on his shirt, based on the fact that he didn't talk the way you talk about money. I set my cup down. You've been in commercial real estate for 14 years, Marcus. You know that the people who announce what they've built are frequently the ones with the least structure underneath it. And the quiet ones, I paused. The quiet ones often own the building. He looked at the table. He looked at me. He said, I hear you, Gerald. I said, good. He signed the new lease on April 8th. $5,340 a month. Dolores processed it. I had my copy in hand by April 10th. I put it in the folder with the rubber band and put the folder back in the second drawer and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I made a fresh cup of coffee. I intended, genuinely, to drink it while it was hot. I didn't, but I appreciated the intention. I want to tell you where things stand because the end of a story like this matters as much as the middle of it, maybe more. Marcus and I are not close. I do not expect that we will become close, but he is present with Renata in the ways that matter. He is patient with Lily and Clara in the ways a good father should be. And 3 months after the lease was signed, at a gathering at their house, he introduced me to someone and he said, this is Gerald Pruitt. He's built more of this city than most people will ever know. He said it without fanfare. He said the way a man says something when he has decided the truth is the more honorable position and has chosen to stand in it. I shook the man's hand. I said, I'm an engineer. I fix things. That's all I've ever done. And that is the truest thing I know how to say about myself. I am not a man of speeches. I am not a man who needs a room to understand what he has done. I see a problem, and I look for the load-bearing element, and I address it at the correct time with the correct force, and I go home, and I make coffee, and I sit at the table with the stain on the left corner, and I think about my granddaughters. Lily still puts a drawing at my place at dinner. Last month it was a horse with a hat on, which I consider an artistic evolution worth encouraging. Clara has declared herself an authority on garlic knots, which she is not, but she is 6, and there is time for the world to refine her. I still drive the 2009 Ranger. The crack in the passenger seat is still there. Some things you leave the way they are, because they remind you where you started, and what it actually cost to get to where you ended up. Here is what I know after 67 years of building things quietly. The man who underestimates you has just handed you every advantage you will ever need. He has told you exactly where he is standing. He has told you exactly what he cannot see. And all you have to do, the only thing you have to do, is be patient enough to let the truth do what it will always, eventually, do on its own. Marcus Holt told me, at his dinner table, that I had never built anything. 31 days later, he signed a lease to stay in the building I had owned for 3 years. I did not remind him of that. I did not need to. The lease said it better than I ever could, in language that required no response and admitted no argument, and will sit in that folder with a rubber band around it for as long as I need it to. Some inheritances are paper. Some are silence. The best ones are both. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one. Ate at the kitchen table with the back window open because it was a warm evening in late June, and the air coming through was a specific kind of warm evening air that smells like cut grass and something green and recent. The garden was doing well. The tomatoes were ahead of where they usually were by this point in the season, which I attributed to the additional compost I had worked into beds in April and the particular angle of the light that summer, which seemed to fall differently on the south bed than it had in previous years. These are the kinds of things I notice. After dinner, I made a cup of coffee and sat at the table and did not drink it. It went cold while I sat there, which is what coffee does when you make it for reasons other than thirst. Marcus called me 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized. We talked for 47 minutes, which was the longest conversation we had managed in close to 2 years. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was doing well and that I meant it. He asked if I was angry. I thought about that question the way it deserved to be thought about. Not quickly, not defensively. I told him that I had been many things over the past 2 years, and that anger had visited, as it was entitled to, but that it had not been the one that stayed. He said he was glad. I told him I was too. We talked for a while longer about other things, his work, a project he was considering, a trip he was thinking about taking. It was a good conversation. I was grateful for it. There are men who spend their entire lives trying to prove to other people that they deserve to be taken seriously. I spent mine simply being serious, quietly, consistently, without announcement or performance, and letting the work speak and letting the documents speak when the moment required documents. Nobody argues with a properly prepared disclosure filed with the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas and assembled by Thomas Breck and Gerald Fitch. That is what I have always found useful about documents. They do not need you to raise your voice. They do not need an audience. They simply state what is true in columns with sources, and they remain true whether or not anyone in the room expected them to be. The F-150 has 231,000 miles on it now. I fixed the passenger side mirror last October. Took 40 minutes and $18 in parts, which I had ordered online and received in 2 days. It runs fine. It will continue to run fine for as long as I give it the attention it requires. I am 64 years old. I am a patient man. I am not going anywhere in particular hurry. Between the truck and me, I like my odds. Some men walk into a courtroom wanting to be seen as powerful. I walked and wanted to be accurate. There is a difference between those two things, and it is not a small one. Power needs an audience. Accuracy does not. Power performs. Accuracy simply is. And accuracy, when it is complete and properly documented and filed with the right court on the right date, has a way of speaking in a room long after you have left it, long after the rolling briefcase has been packed up and wheeled out, long after the smile has faded from the face of the man who wore it so confidently on a Friday morning in March. 31 years of building, 1 yellow legal pad, 4 months and 13 days, and an attorney who knew, on the first day I walked into her office, exactly what Thorough was going to look like. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.